I sat in the back of my attorney's car outside the Charleston County Courthouse and watched my brother-in-law straighten his cufflinks through the glass doors. He had that look he always got before closing a deal. Shoulders back, jaw set, the particular stillness of a man who believes he has already won. My sister stood beside him in a charcoal blazer, not looking at me. She hadn't looked at me in 6 weeks. I had a small voice recorder clipped inside my blazer pocket, right against my ribs. I could feel it every time I breathed. I pressed my hand flat against my chest, felt the hard edge of it, and remembered what my grandmother used to say whenever I was scared. She said, "Still water runs deep, baby. Let them underestimate you." I thought about that for a long moment. Then I got out of the car. Before I tell you what happened inside that courtroom, and I will tell you everything, you need to understand what was taken from me and how long it took me to realize it was being taken at all. My grandmother, Nana Joel, passed away 14 months ago. She was 81 years old, and she died the way she lived, on her own terms, in her own house, with her garden still growing outside her bedroom window. She left behind a 3-bedroom home in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, a piece of land her parents had owned since the 1940s, and a savings account that nobody in the family knew the full size of except her attorney and apparently me. She left it all to me. Not to my mother, not to my Aunt Patricia, not to my sister Brooke and her husband, who had been managing Nana Joe's finances for the last 4 years and had apparently assumed that managing meant inheriting. All of it. To me. The house valued at just over $490,000 in that market. The land, and $214,000 in a savings account she had been quietly building since before my mother was born. I was 31 years old. A middle school art teacher making $43,000 a year, and my grandmother had just handed me a life. I didn't understand what that would cost me. The reading of the will happened on a Tuesday afternoon in an attorney's office off Coleman Boulevard. My mother sat to my left, and Patricia to my right. Brooke and her husband, I'll call him Neil, sat directly across from me. Neil is a commercial real estate developer. He has the handshake of a man who wants you to know he makes more money than you. He had been driving Nana Joe to her doctor's appointments for 2 years, handling her mail, helping her navigate her accounts, which I later learned meant he had become her informal financial advisor and had been very quietly steering her toward a different estate plan entirely. The attorney, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Hendricks, read the document without drama. There was a moment of complete silence when he finished. Then Neil said, "That can't be right." Not to Mr. Hendricks, not to anyone in particular. Just out loud. Like a fact he was correcting. My mother turned to look at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It wasn't anger. It was something colder. It was the look of a woman recalculating. Patricia started crying immediately, which I had expected. Patricia cried at everything. Weddings, grocery store commercials, the end of a good meal. But these tears felt different. There was no warmth in them. I sat very still and thought about my grandmother. I thought about the Tuesday afternoons I had spent with her for the last 12 years. Every single Tuesday, bringing her sweet tea from the place on Highway 17 she liked. Sitting at her kitchen table while she showed me her old photographs and told me stories about people I would never meet. I thought about how she used to hold my hand when I was little and say, "You see things other people walk right past, Cecily. Don't ever let anyone convince you that's a weakness." I hadn't known she was leaving me anything. I want to be clear about that. I hadn't known, and it didn't change anything about those Tuesday afternoons. But sitting in that office, I understood that she had known. She had been watching all of us for years, and she had made her decision. I said very little. I thanked Mr. Hendricks. I asked for a copy of the document. I walked to my car. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. By the time I got home, I had 3 missed calls from my mother and a text from Brooke that said, "We need to talk. This isn't what Nana Joe would have wanted. Neil has documentation." I stared at that last sentence for a long time. Neil has documentation. I didn't know what that meant yet. I would learn. The pressure started slowly. That's the thing nobody tells you about family manipulation. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive at your door with a crowbar. It seeps in through the cracks you already have, through the guilt you already carry, through every time you were ever told you were selfish or difficult or too much. My mother called me the next morning and explained, in her most reasonable voice, that Nana Jo had not been fully herself in her final years, that she had been confused about certain family dynamics, that Neil had been such a devoted caretaker, and I had been so busy, she added, with a pause that said everything, that it only made sense the estate should reflect that reality. She used the word fair 4 times in 8 minutes. I love you, she said at the end. We just want what's fair. I told her I needed time to think. She said, of course, take all the time you need. The warmth in her voice had the particular quality of patience being performed. Neil called 2 days later. He was more direct. He told me there were debts associated with the property, maintenance costs, taxes in arrears, a situation with the septic system, and that selling was really the only financially responsible option. He had a buyer ready, a developer. The offer was fair, he said. He would personally ensure my portion was handled correctly. My portion. That was the first time I felt it clearly. The shift from this is hers to this is ours, and she's being difficult about it. It had happened without a single conversation I could point to. I had been repositioned in the family narrative from granddaughter who was loved, to obstacle to a reasonable outcome. And I hadn't even seen it happen. I told Neil I wasn't selling. I told him the house was going to remain in the family. I told him I was planning to move in. The silence on the phone lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said very quietly, "You should think very carefully about that." I hung up. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a South Carolina Adult Protective Services caseworker. She was polite, almost apologetic. She explained that a concerned family member had filed a report suggesting that I had exerted undue influence over an elderly person. Specifically that I had isolated my grandmother in her final years, manipulated her emotional state, and deliberately positioned myself to benefit from her diminished capacity. I sat down on my kitchen floor, literally just sat down on the tile. The caseworker explained there would need to be an investigation, that it was standard, that I shouldn't be alarmed. But the words undue influence and diminished capacity were sitting in my chest like something swallowed wrong. I called my own attorney that afternoon. Her name is Gwen. She is 53 years old, has never in her professional life raised her voice, and is the most precise person I have ever met. When I finished explaining everything, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Tell me about your visits with your grandmother. How often? What you talked about? Whether anyone else was present." I told her about every Tuesday for 12 years. She said, "Good. Now, do you have any of it in writing? Texts, emails, cards?" I thought about the box of birthday cards I had kept. The texts. The voicemails I'd never deleted because I couldn't bring myself to. The dozens of photographs on my phone of the 2 of us at her kitchen table or in her garden or at the beach that one October when she said she wanted to feel the cold water one more time. I had all of it. Gwen said, "Then we have a foundation. But I want you to listen to me carefully. This is going to get worse before it gets better. They are going to try to make you look unstable. They are going to try to make you look isolated and grasping and ungrateful. Your job, your only job, is to not give them any ammunition." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Don't argue. Don't explain yourself on social media. Don't call your mother and cry. Don't give your brother-in-law the satisfaction of seeing you rattled. Whatever they do next, I want you to be the stillest person in any room." Still water runs deep. I thought about my grandmother and I said, "Okay." What they did next was worse than I had imagined. It was a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the will reading. I had been spending weekends at Nana Jo's house. My house technically, though it still didn't feel like it, sorting through her things carefully, making decisions slowly, trying to honor her the right way. The house had a particular smell I was terrified of losing. Cedar and old paper and the lavender sachet she kept in every drawer. I had gone out for coffee. I was gone maybe 45 minutes. When I came back, the back door was standing open. I walked in slowly. The kitchen was fine. The living room was fine. And then I went down the hallway toward the small room Nana Jo had used as a study, where she kept her important documents and her collection of family photographs. Decades of them, organized in albums going back to the 1930s. The room had been gone through, not ransacked violently, not destroyed. That would have been obvious, would have looked like what it was. This was something more deliberate. Drawers pulled out and replaced at slightly wrong angles, the filing cabinet sitting 2 inches from the wall instead of flush against it, albums stacked in a different order than I had left them. And one thing missing. My grandmother had kept a personal journal for the last 20 years. A simple composition notebook, replaced every January, stacked in a box in the bottom of the closet. The journals from the last 3 years were gone. I stood in that room for a long time. I didn't touch anything. I took photographs of every drawer, every cabinet, every detail that was wrong. Then I called Gwen. She told me to call the non-emergency police line and file a report. She told me to note the missing journals specifically. She asked me one question. Did you change the locks when you took possession? I had not. That was my mistake, and I knew it the second she asked. The locks were changed that afternoon. I filed the report. The officer who came was professionally skeptical in the way that cops are when something feels like a family dispute dressed up as a crime. I didn't argue with his tone. I just showed him the photographs and told him what was missing. 2 days later, Neil sent me an email. It was formal, almost corporate in its language. He said that he had removed certain personal items from the property that he believed held sentimental significance to the broader family unit, and that he would be happy to return them as part of a mediated conversation about the estate's future. He CC'd a family attorney I had never heard of. I forwarded it to Gwen without a word. She sent back 3 words. Perfect. Thank you. That was the moment I understood. He had just documented himself. He thought those journals were going to hurt me. Maybe there was something in them about my visits, some ambiguous line he could use. Some moment of my grandmother's confusion he could frame as evidence of my manipulation. He had taken them because he believed they were a weapon. What he didn't know was that my grandmother had told me, over sweet tea at her kitchen table, that she had started keeping a separate record, not in the composition notebooks, a small leather journal, the kind with a strap and a brass clasp, that she kept in her bedside table under her extra reading glasses. Just in case, she had said. In case anyone ever tries to rewrite things. I had found that journal the first weekend I spent at the house. I had read it once, slowly, and then I had placed it in a safety deposit box at my credit union downtown. Neil had taken the wrong notebooks. The Adult Protective Services investigation concluded 6 weeks later. The caseworker called me to say the report had been found unsubstantiated. My records, the photographs, the 12 years of documented visits, my grandmother's medical records showing consistent cognitive function until the final 3 months of her life. All of it had been reviewed. There was no evidence of isolation or undue influence. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt a sick, steady dread, because I knew Neil and my sister and my mother were not finished. I was right. The civil suit was filed on a Thursday. Neil, my mother, and Aunt Patricia were listed as plaintiffs. The filing alleged that the will had been executed during a period of cognitive decline, that I had deliberately excluded other family members from my grandmother's life during her final years, and that the bequest represented a product of undue influence that should be voided by the court. My mother had signed it. Her signature was right there on the document. The same woman who had said, "I love you, we just want what's fair," had signed a legal document calling me a predator. Gwen reviewed the filing and told me to come in the next morning. I drove to that meeting holding the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached. I sat across from Gwen's desk and she slid a copy of the filing across to me and let me read the whole thing in silence. When I finished, I looked up at her. She said, "This is serious. It is also winnable, but I need to ask you something important and I need you to answer honestly. Is there anything, any interaction with your grandmother in those final years that could be characterized even unfairly as pressure?" I thought about it carefully. I thought about the Tuesday she had told me she wanted to change her estate plan. And I had said, Nana, that's your business, not mine. I don't need you to leave me anything. I thought about the time she had offered me money for a car repair and I had refused it. I thought about every moment I had been careful, instinctively careful, because I knew even then that I was the one she loved most openly and that there were people in the family who would never forgive me for that. No, I said, there isn't. Gwen nodded slowly. Then I want you to trust me on something. I want you to reach out to your mother. Tell her you want to meet. Accept whatever invitation she extends. Be warm. Be present. Don't defend yourself. Don't argue the will. Just show up. I stared at her. You want me to walk into a room with the people suing me. I want you to walk into a room wearing your grandmother's brooch, she said. I had told Gwen about the brooch. It had belonged to my grandmother, a delicate oval piece, Art Deco with a pale blue stone at the center. Nana Jo had given it to me 3 years before she died, told me it suited me. I wore it sometimes. What Gwen had suggested doing to it was the kind of thing I would have dismissed as dramatic before the last 4 months of my life had happened to me. Now it seemed like the most sensible thing in the world. The brooch had been fitted by a woman Gwen knew who did personal security work, with a small camera in the stone housing and a microphone woven into the filigree at the back. You would have to know what you were looking for to find it. Even knowing it was there, I could barely see it. My mother called me 2 days after I reached out. She was warm, careful. She said she had been praying about the situation. She said she missed me. She said she thought we should have dinner, just the family, just to talk things through, because this wasn't what anyone wanted, and maybe there was a way forward that didn't involve lawyers. She said, "We're your family, sweetheart. Whatever happened with the will, we're still your family." I told her I would come. I wore a simple dress that Sunday, dark green, the brooch at the collar. I had tested it 3 times the night before. I drove to my mother's house in the early evening, parked on the street, and sat in my car for a moment with both hands in my lap. I thought about the caseworker's phone call. I thought about Neil's email. I thought about my sister standing in that courthouse lobby not looking at me. I thought about my grandmother's kitchen and the smell of cedar and lavender and the weight of her hand on mine. Then I went inside. The table was set nicely. My mother had made the pot roast she always made for significant occasions. Patricia was there, and Neil, and Brooke, who finally looked at me when I walked in, briefly, assessing. There was a man I didn't recognize sitting at the end of the table, who was introduced to me as a friend of Neil's. A notary public, I would later confirm. I understood immediately. This was not dinner. This was the closing. I sat down. I let my mother serve me. I made conversation about nothing. The weather, my students, a book I'd been reading. I watched Neil watch me. He had the focused quality of a man waiting for a signal. The wine came out after the main course. My mother poured generously. It was a deep red, and when she set the glass in front of me, I noticed the smell almost immediately. Something sweet underneath the tannins, something that didn't belong there. Faintly chemical. Faintly sweet in the way of something dissolved. I had read in the weeks leading up to this dinner about the pharmacology of common sedatives. Gwen had told me to read up. I'm not certain what was in that wine. I know what it smelled like. I know that I lifted the glass, held it near my mouth, and set it back down without drinking. I coughed slightly, touched my napkin to my lips. Let my eyes go soft. A few minutes later, I let my shoulders drop. I let my speech slow. I let myself seem, very gently, like someone becoming imprecise. Neil produced documents shortly after. He explained them to me carefully in the slow voice of a man explaining something to someone who might not fully grasp it. A power of attorney. A revised directive regarding the estate. He said it was the right thing for everyone. He said Nana Jo would have wanted the family taken care of. He said I had always been too young to manage something of this size. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over mine. I let the recorder run. What followed was 22 minutes of conversation that I can only describe as a demolition of everything they had claimed in court. Neil talked about the APS report, how they had filed it to create a paper trail. Not because they believed it. My sister said, in a voice I didn't recognize from her, that she had spoken to a specialist who could testify about cognitive decline in elderly patients. My mother, holding my hand, said, "She always loved you the most. That's why we need you to do this. She wasn't thinking clearly, you know that. You can fix it. Just sign and it's over." The notary was watching me. He had a pen ready. I looked at my mother's hand over mine, the same hand that had braided my hair when I was 6, the same hand that had held mine at my grandmother's bedside in the last week. I looked at her face and I waited to feel something softer than what I felt. What I felt was the recorder against my ribs and the brooch at my collar and 12 years of Tuesday afternoons that nobody could take from me. I said, "I'm going to need some air." I stood up slowly, the way someone slightly unsteady might stand. I walked to the hallway. I stood by the front door and took a breath. I texted Gwen a single word, confirmed. She had been parked 2 blocks away. The hearing was 3 weeks later. The plaintiffs had filed a motion to expedite given my demonstrated instability, which was not a real legal standard but which Gwen let stand without objection, because it meant the hearing came faster. Neil testified first. He was polished and composed. He described my grandmother's confusion, her dependence on me, her vulnerability. He described the will as the product of a relationship that had been, in his words, systematically cultivated at the expense of the broader family. He used the word exploitation twice. My mother cried at the right moments. Patricia twisted a tissue in her hands. I sat at the table and I was still. I was the stillest person in that room. I had my grandmother's brooch pinned to my lapel. When Gwen stood to present her evidence, the room had the particular texture of a space where people believe they know what's coming. Neil had a small, controlled smile. He had documents. He had a notary. He had 3 plaintiffs and a medical expert on standby. Gwen said, "Your Honor, I'd like to play an audio recording." She played it through the courtroom speakers. 22 minutes, almost all of it. My mother's voice filling the room. She wasn't thinking clearly. "Just sign, and it's over." Neil's voice. "We filed the report to create a paper trail." My sister's voice, measured and careful, discussing testimony she intended to fabricate. I watched Neil's face during the playback. I watched the smile leave it. I watched him lean over to his attorney and say something urgent and low. I watched my mother's hands go to her face. Gwen then presented the video. The brooch camera had captured the notary sitting at the table with documents ready before I had been told why I was there for dinner. It had captured the wine being poured. It had captured the wine being poured. It had captured Neil producing the pen and directing the notary's positioning. It had captured 22 minutes of conspiracy laid out over pot roast and a South Carolina Merlot. Neil said, "That's edited," before his attorney put a hand on his arm. Gwen then placed my grandmother's leather journal into evidence. The private one. The one with the brass clasp. The one that lived under the reading glasses. My grandmother had written in her careful looping hand about every visit Neil had made in those 4 years. She had written about the accounts he'd suggested moving, the advisors he'd recommended, the papers he'd brought for her to sign. She had written, 8 months before she died, "Neil asked me again today about the estate plan. I told him I had taken care of it. He pressed me. I told him the matter was settled. He smiled and said, of course, whatever I wished. He has that smile like a door closing." The judge was a woman in her late 50s, with the manner of someone who has heard every version of this particular story and is tired of all of them. She listened to everything. She reviewed the documents Gwen submitted. She asked Neil 2 questions, quietly, and his answers satisfied nothing. She denied the motion to void the will. She granted full title to the estate without contest. She referred the matter of the doctored wine, the fabricated APS report, and the attempted coercion to the county prosecutor's office for review. She looked at Neil for a long moment before she adjourned. She did not look at him warmly. In the hallway afterward, I stood outside the courtroom doors and I breathed. Just breathed. The building had that specific institutional air. cold and slightly recycled, and I stood in it and thought about my grandmother, who had kept a little leather journal just in case because she knew her family and she loved them anyway, and she loved me enough to leave me a way out of the story they wanted to tell about me. Gwen came out and stood beside me. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother knew what she was doing when she left you that house?" I said, "She always did." It has been 7 months since that hearing. The county prosecutor did open an inquiry. I have been told not to discuss the specifics of that process publicly. Neil and my sister have relocated. My mother has not contacted me directly, though Patricia sent me a card at Christmas that said, "Only I'm sorry," with no explanation and no return address. I moved into the house in October. I planted things in the garden my grandmother had kept. The same lavender she used for the sachets, the same climbing roses along the back fence. The cedar smell is still there, in the walls, in the closets. I kept the leather journal in the safety deposit box until the legal proceedings were concluded. Then I brought it home and I set it on the table in the study, in the room with the window that looks out over the garden. I read it sometimes, not to remind myself of what they did. I've let most of that go, or I'm letting it go, which is the best I can honestly say. I read it because her voice is in it, because she was watching all of it, all those years with her clear, careful eyes, and she saw me. She saw me the way you need someone to see you at least once, to know that you exist in the way you think you do. I have a friend who keeps asking me what the lesson is. She wants a clean takeaway, something quotable. I understand the impulse. The closest I've come is this. My grandmother did not leave me that house as a reward. She left it as a record of who showed up. A record of who sat at the table every Tuesday when there was nothing to gain and no audience watching. A record of the kind of love that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. They were so certain that silence meant weakness. They watched me sit in courtrooms and across dinner tables, and they read my stillness as surrender. They never considered that the woman who raised me had been whispering the same thing into my ear since I was old enough to listen. Still water runs deep, baby. I live in my grandmother's house now. I teach my students on weekdays and I work in the garden on weekends. And I am, for the first time in my adult life, not bracing for the next thing. I am not at war. I am just home. I think about cause and effect a lot more than I used to. Not in some abstract philosophical way, I mean practically, concretely. The way you think about it when you've watched a set of choices play out to their logical end right in front of you. Neil made a series of decisions. Each one felt, I'm sure, like a smart move. File the APS report to build a paper trail. Take the journals before I could use them. Invite me to dinner. Pour the wine. Have the notary ready. Every step was calculated. Every step was calculated, and every step was also, without him knowing it, evidence. That's the thing about people who believe they're the smartest person in the room. They stop asking whether anyone else is paying attention. Neil never considered that I might be watching him the same way he was watching me. He never considered that my grandmother might have been watching him for 4 years with her clear, careful eyes and writing it down in a little leather journal with a brass clasp. He never considered that the woman he had written off as a naive schoolteacher might have an attorney who thought 3 moves ahead. He didn't lose because he was unlucky. He lost because every action has a weight to it, and his actions had been accumulating for years before I even knew there was anything to fight. I've thought a lot about what Nana Jo understood that the rest of them didn't. She was not a wealthy woman by most standards. She was not powerful in any visible way. She was a woman who kept a garden and wrote in composition notebooks and made sweet tea from scratch and paid attention. She paid attention to who showed up and who didn't. She paid attention to what people did when there was nothing to gain. She paid attention to the difference between someone who loved her and someone who was managing her. That's intelligence in its truest form, I think. Not the kind that gets tested or credentialed. The kind that sees clearly because it isn't clouded by wanting something. And I think about what it took for me to get through those months. Not the legal strategy, though Gwen was extraordinary. I mean the internal part. The part where you have to choose over and over again to stay quiet when every instinct is screaming, to stay measured when someone is publicly calling you a predator. To sit at a dinner table holding a glass of drugged wine and let your face show nothing. That took something I didn't know I had. I'm not going to call it strength because that word gets used for too many things. I'll call it conviction. The conviction that the truth was real even when nobody in that room was speaking it. The conviction that my grandmother's Tuesday afternoons were real even when a legal document was trying to rewrite them. The conviction that I did not have to become what they accused me of being in order to survive what they were doing to me. People tell me I was brave. I don't feel like I was brave. I feel like I was cornered and I chose not to panic. That's not the same thing, but maybe that's what most of what we call bravery actually is. Not the absence of fear, but the decision not to let it make your choices for you. Nana Joe is gone. That part doesn't get easier. I walk through her house and I hear her in it sometimes, in the way the floorboards sound, or the way the light comes through the kitchen window in the late afternoon. The garden is growing. The lavender is coming back. I kept her brooch. I don't wear it the same way anymore. It's heavier now, in the way objects get heavy when they've been through something. But I keep it. It sits on the windowsill in the study next to the leather journal, and some mornings I pick it up and hold it for a minute before I start the day. She gave it to me because she said it suited me. I think she was right.